Good evening. Good evening, Ben. Good evening, Shiur. How are you all?
Good evening, how are you?
We're coming live from London, capital city. I hope you feel it's extra chashivus. Here in London, Baruch Hashem, it seems the corona is a lot better than it is.
Yeah?
It's a bit more relaxed about it.
Yeah, not like Manchester.
Oh, I understand.
Whereabouts are you in London?
Gold is green. Gold is green.
The Chasna's tomorrow.
Chasna is tomorrow night, yeah, but it's not, Chasna is not actually in London. The Chasna is like an outlying town from London. It's about a 2-hour journey from London.
Right.
So I didn't want to drive like 5-6 hours on the day.
Yeah.
Chasna is also not, has to finish early because of all the legal requirements.
Yeah.
The show will be tomorrow morning, it's a show.
Okay. I'll probably watch it during the day.
Right. What's news in Manchester?
We're going into tier 3.
Are we?
Yeah. As of Friday.
Really, the whole tier business is mainly about pubs. It's not really much.
Yeah, it's not really going to affect us. It's the pubs have to close early. That's all it really means. And gyms, pubs and gyms, that's all it is.
I wonder what about dentists. I'm trying to get, okay. Right. We are up to Daf and base on Mud Aleph, 1 line down, 1.5 lines down. I just want to summarize what we learned yesterday in order that it should be clearer. There's such a thing called Eiruvin Chatzeros, and there's such a thing called Shitufei Mavoyos. So I'm actually going to be learning about it tomorrow as well. So it's kedai to have it clear. Eiruvin Chatzeros is a group of people living around one chotzer. There's a double problem. They can't take from the house to the chotzer, and they can't carry within the chotzer. They can't carry from the house to the chotzer, because the house is a private domain, and the chotzer belongs to many people. And they can't carry within the chotzer, because the chotzer is similar to Rishus Harabim. So that's the two issues with a chotzer. And for that, you have to Eiruvin Chatzeros. What food can you use for Eiruvin Chatzeros? Anybody remember? Which food does it have to be?
Bread.
Bread.
Only bread works. Why only bread? Why only bread? Why can't I use wine or oil or toffees or chocolates?
Be a meal or something like meal to eat.
It's more than that. It's because
It needs to be a
Eiruvin
proper
Chatzeros,
food
I want to
that
make
person thinks of.
Eiruvin Chatzeros, I want to make the chotzer my home. And I want to be able to carry from my house into the chotzer. My house is my most important place of living. So therefore, carrying from my house into the chotzer, I have to be able to have bread, which is the most choshev of all foods. Ma'ashe'inkin shetufei mavois. What is shetufei mavois? Shetufei mavois is simply where we have a few chatzeros, right? For example, we have a few cul-de-sacs, and we just want to be able to carry from one cul-de-sac to another. So we're not discussing moving from the house to the chotzer, we're discussing moving from one chotzer to another. So for that, any food will work. Actually, there's 2 foods that doesn't work. Does anybody remember which 2 foods doesn't work for Shtufim?
Salt and
water.
Very good. Salt and water. Oh, mamish. Salt and water doesn't work for Shtufim voice. Everything else, from chocolate to apples, works. Except for Eiruvin Chatzeros, only bread. That was the first thing we learned. The second thing we learned is a machlokes tanoim, which again going to keep coming back to. And the machlokes tanoim is, if a person does one without the other, does it work? That means lechatchila everybody agrees. You first make a Eiruvin Chatzeros. That means you make the chotzer into one area, and then afterwards you make a shituf mavoyos. That is the lechatchila. That's the correct way. We had the machlokes tanoim. If you do one without the other, does it work or not? And then we had the machlokes within the machlokes. The machlokes within the machlokes is as follows. What happens if you did shetufei mavois with wine? That means, we all know that Eiruvin Chatzeros you have to use bread. And this person went and did shetufei mavois with wine. So one man Dama holds, in such a case, nobody could possibly hold that the shitufei mavois works for the Eiruvin Chatzeros. How can it? The Eiruvin Chatzeros itself needs bread. You're going to rely on the shitufei mavois, which is made out of wine, for the bread. That doesn't make any sense. The other Mandama holds that yes, it does. Why? Why would it work? The answer is as follows. Because once the wine works for the Shittuf Mavoyos, so therefore the wine makes it that we're all living together. Now, the question was, we never bothered making Eiruvin Chatzeros. It doesn't matter. Why not? Because since we made a Shittuf Mavoyos, so therefore the fact that we don't have Eiruvin Chatzeros, that is okay. So let's summarize what we've learned. Regarding Eiruvin Chatzeros, you have to use bread. Shittuf Mavoyos can use anything you want except for water and salt. Regarding relying on the Eiruvin Chatzeros when you haven't got Shittuf Mavoyos, all the other way around, you've got Shittuf Mavoyos and you haven't got Eiruvin Chatzeros, that is a machlokes tanoim between Chachamim and Rameh, whether one works without the other. Within the machlokes Chachamim and Rameh, we have a machlokes where they arguing in a case where you use bread for Shittuf Mavoyos, and therefore the machlokes is since you use bread for Shittuf Mavoyos, maybe it should work for Eiruvin Chatzeros as well. Or were they arguing even in a case where you have wine, and even in such a case where you use for the Shittuf Mavoyos an ingredient of food which you couldn't even use for Eiruvin Chatzeros, nevertheless it works. That's a very big chiddush. That means once the wine has the ability to connect us all for the Shittuf Mavoyos, perhaps then we don't need the Eiruvin Chatzeros. That's the last thing we did. The machlokes within the machlokes. It was about machlokes Eiruvin Chatzeros, that's Shittuf Mavoyos, and vice versa. And the machlokes are we talking about when you did bread or wine? The more now asks a kasha and based on that 1.5 lines in Meisvei. The kasha is that we're going to have a brisa, which the Chachamim and Rameh argue, and the brisa begins with the halachas that Eiruvin Chatzeros works with bread and Shittuf Mavoyos works with wine, and then the brisa continues by saying the machlokes Chachamim and Rameh whether you can rely on one without the other. A simple reading of the brisa would suggest that what? What would you say? That can you rely on Shittuf Mavoyos, which is made out of wine, when you haven't bothered the Eiruvin Chatzeros? What would you say from the simple understanding of the brisa?
Probably no.
I'm afraid to tell you no. I'm afraid to tell you yes. Why? Think of it. I start off a sentence and I say it like this: Eiruvin Chatzeros is bread, Shittuf Mavoyos is wine. And if you make Shittuf Mavoyos and you never bothered Eiruvin Chatzeros, it's good enough. Now, what did I just tell you? That my Shittuf Mavoyos was made out of wine. And after Pikain, I'm telling you that if you didn't bother with Eiruvin Chatzeros, it's also good enough. It is a right that you can have Shittuf Mavoyos of wine and still not have Eiruvin Chatzeros, and it's still good enough. Let's see the Gemara inside. Meisvei. V'chachomim oimim. Oy me'arvin, oy mishtatfin. Or an Eruv, or a Shittuf. One without the other works. And this is a continuation of the previous line of the Gemara Brisa, which the Gemara doesn't bother quoting, which we should remember from when we learned it last time, where the Brisa begins by talking about Eiruvin Chatzeros, the bread, Shittuf Mavoyos, the wine. Says the Gemara, my love, does it not mean Oy ma'avin b'chotzer b'pas? Either you can use bread for your Eiruvin Chatzeros, or mishtatfin b'mavi b'yayin, or you can use wine for Shittuf Mavoyos. And nevertheless, even though you only used wine for your Shittuf Mavoyos, you don't need to bother with your Eiruvin Chatzeros. Is a raya that even wine can work for Eiruvin Chatzeros. Omar Gidam Rav, no, he changes the expression of the Brisa. Hochi Omar, Oy me'avin b'chotzer b'pas u'mutorin kan v'kan, Oy mishtatfin b'mavi b'pas u'mutorin kan v'kan. When the Brisa says that if you use a Shittuf, you do not need to use Eiruvin Chatzeros, it's only talking about a case where for the Shittuf Mavoyos you use bread. If you bother to use bread for the Shittuf Mavoyos, then you don't need for the Eiruvin Chatzeros anything. But if you use the Shittuf Mavoyos wine, then of course you cannot rely on your Eiruvin Chatzeros. Therefore, you've got no raya whatsoever from this price. Again, we had machlokes Tanakam and Rameh. The Chachamim, I should say. The Chachamim hold that it's possible to do one without the other. Right? Imagine you do a Shittuf Mavoyos without Eiruvin Chatzeros, or Eiruvin Chatzeros without Shittuf Mavoyos, it will work. Rameh says, no, you have to do both. That means you can't rely on one without the other. Says the Gemara now, 3 expressions. We passed like Rameh, but we had this before, 3 levels of passing like Rameh. If you remember, what's the 3 expressions? Let's see more inside. Omar Yehuda Rav, halacha k'Rameh. The halacha is like Rameh. Vavon Omar, minhag k'Rameh. The minhag is like Rameh. People have become used to behaving like Rameh. That's 3 levels. What are the 3 levels of practicalities? Anybody remember the 3 levels? Halacha means that we publicly declare the halachas like Rameya. Minhag means we don't publicly declare it, but if somebody privately asks the question, we say to him, the halachas like Rameya. Noagu means we don't even tell a private individual it's like Rameya. Rather, what do? If somebody behaves like Rameya, we do not tell him off because we understand that he has who to rely on. He's got epis shitta to rely on. So that's 3 levels. We've had this many times, and we're going to have it again many times. It's glad to remember. Halacha means that it's definitely like Rameya. You can even publicly get up on your Shabbos Shuvah drasha and pass like Rameya. Minhag means that privately we pass like Rameya, but we don't publicly declare it. Noagu means people behave like Rameya, but we ourselves never declare that the halacha is like Rameya. Tosef here asks a very strong question. I was hoping that somebody would jump up and ask it. What's the obvious question over here?
But we're never paskin like Rameya.
That's a nice question. I like the question, but that's not the question of Tosef. At the end of the day, that the Gemara does say that sometimes we do pass like Rameya. So I hear the question. The Gemara does say itma, where we've learned clearly we do pass like Rameya. I think it's a more simple question. That Rameya is being machmir or meikol. What's Rameya being over here?
Yeah, he's being machmir. We should be meikol with Eiruvin.
Oh, okay. You've asked me another question, which is also good. And the Rishonim asked you a question, but that's not the question of Tosfos. Again, Rameya is being machmir, as you correctly said, Ben. Rameya is being machmir. Normally, when somebody's being machmir, it's very hard to tell him off. Meaning like this: if Rameya is being meikol, so we say 3 levels. You pass like Rameya publicly. We pass like him privately, or if somebody behaves like Rameya, we're not going to object because we know that Rameya says like him. But if Rameya is being machmir, what would that have him in the meeting to object? Again, somebody made their Ruvei Chatzeros and he forgot to do a Shutuf Meboyos. According to the Chachamim, he doesn't need to bother. He should have done it. He never did it. It's okay. Comes along Rameya and says, no, you have to do both. So now we have 3 levels of passing like Rameya. Either the halacha is like him, or we privately like him, or we say, or we behave like him. What do you mean we behave like him? What would it be otherwise? Let's say somebody behaves like Rameya. What are you going to do? Tell him off? What are you going to tell him off for? Anyway, he's being machmir. You can't shout at him. You can only shout at somebody who's going against the halacha, where he's going to make him. But what do you care? Let him do a ruach adishut for voice. Anybody want to suggest an answer?
You don't need to tell him off, but you can tell him what the halacha is. You can tell him
Yeah,
you don't
but
need to be
the
so machmir.
idea of nohagu, Rashi many times says this. Nohagu means ein moichin biyodam. We don't protest. That means, let's say somebody does something which api halacha, there's no basis, we protest. Here we're saying that Rameya says it, so you can't protest. So this gives many answers. I thought maybe somebody would chaparine, maybe an answer. One answer is like this: that let's say he wants to make a bracha after made a Ruvei Chatzeros, he wants to make a bracha on Shutufim Mevoyos, he can't. And this person's going like Rameya, making a new bracha. We say to him, what are you doing? We pass like the Chachamim. The answer is we don't protest. Or he was about to make a bris, he forgot the knife, and he didn't want to rely on Shutufim Mevoyos because he didn't do it, so he doesn't bother making a bris milah. So then we're relying on Rameya, so to speak, it's coming out to Rameya kula. So there are certain cases. The reason why this Tosfos is very fundamental is once the Manchester Basin was made the Eruv, there were many Rabbanim, whether they liked the Eruv or didn't, said, but from now on, if you ever do want to make a private Eruv, what should you do? You have to make it without a bracha. You cannot make a bracha. I always make an Eruv, my own person. But I don't make a bracha. How can you make a bracha? The reality is, according to many persons who have got a perfectly fine Eruv, you can't make another bracha on your Eruv. What do you talk about? And this is Mamish Lesitosis a little bit inside. It's the second, it's the first Diva Maska, it's the first wide line. The Rashi says, "We make basa the times for fire. So we don't pass them. We have dinner and we don't tell him off. This man, how can you possibly tell him off? He's being machmir like Rameya. What are you going to shout at him? We can't say to him, how can you make a new bracha on your shituf? You're doing a bracha levatol, you already got over chatzeros. No, that we don't do because we've got Rameya to rely on. Okay, so that is the halacha, and it's very important. Okay, it's nice, and nowadays I have to admit it's not so common. We don't bother with shutuf mevoyos altogether. We just do what's called the Ruvei Chatzeros of the whole town. We do not do shutuf mevoyos. We just make one very big area of Chatzeros as if the whole town is one Chatzah. But one has to know that it is a machlokes Tanakama Chachamim and Rameya, which we're going to come back to if you do one without the other. New Mishnah. Chamisha chavuros sheshovsu b'trakli nechad. You've got a huge hall, and 5 families set up shop in one hall, and they make small little fences between them. Now, they want to carry from the hall into the whole garden. What would you say? Do they need to make an Eruv or not? Now, the Rambam very beautifully starts off, which is really to help us. He says like this. Imagine a person's got a very big family, and he has guests, and he has visitors, and a Rebbe, and all the people all around sitting in his house. Does he need to make an Eruv to his garden? No. Ben's saying no, and he's correct. Why? Because it's one family. The fact that we're not actually genetically a family, we're not really blood related. This is my neighbor's cousin, and this is my friend's niece. We're all living together. We're all living together. It's one family. You do not need to make an Eruv. The problem with our Mishnah is it's 5 separate families, and for whatever reason they couldn't afford to have their own home, so they all set up shop in one hall. And then they make small divisions between them. So, Beishamai Omim, Eruv l'chol chabor v'chabor. They have to make an Eruv. And this is a double chumrah. What's the double chumrah, Rashi says? Chumrah number 1, within their own hallway, they will not be able to carry. Imagine, you've got to picture it, a big like hall, chasna hall, a gym. And what happens is, let's say there's been an evacuation. So what happens is, suddenly loads of families are stuck into one hall for the shilas. So people like a little bit of privacy. So what do? They make little curtains between each one, for example. So now one of them wants to pass a slice of bread from one partition to the second partition. Say Beis Shammai, what do they need to do? They need to make an Eruv, because it's separate houses, just like you can't carry from your neighbor's house to your house, even less than you live in a semi-detached house. Unless the semi-detached house has a window between the two. You can't pass through. This is your house, this is my house. So over here, you can't pass through the hall because every partition is a separate house. That's one chumrah of Beis Shammai, and there's a second chumrah of Beis Shammai. What's the second chumrah of Beis Shammai? You won't be able to carry into the garden because it's like 5 separate families, 5 separate homes, 5 homes, 1 garden, shared garden. You can't carry from the home into the garden. So that's the 2 chumras of Beis Shammai. You just need 1 Eruv and you're satisfied. Meaning that what? That it's one family. Says the Gemara, says the Mishnah on Moedim. They still agree. If they have separate rooms, that means one person lives upstairs, one downstairs. Sometimes on King's Road, there's a lot of these houses where the upstairs is one flat and the downstairs is with another flat. People rent them out. So what would you say? Let's say these 2 flats want to be able to carry from one to the other. Do they need to make an Eruv? Even Beis Hillel say need to make an Eruv. Why? So, for example, we talked about this many times. If you go to a hotel for Shabbos, so the fact is you need to make an Eruv from one room to the next, as long as it's seated. If it's all going, you're okay. I saw brought down a Tshuva of Chasam Sofer, interesting svar, that he says that maybe not, maybe you don't need to make an Eruv. It's a question. He says like this. I don't know about nowadays, but I've not been to a hotel. I don't think I can't remember last time I went to a hotel. But you sleep in one room and you eat in a shared dining room. If that's the case, so the Chasam Sofer then starts declaring, do you really consider it as if we're all living in one room, or are we living in separate rooms? The Gemara talks about it later a little bit. But let's say in a normal hotel, in a hotel where you eat and sleep in your own room, then everybody agrees that if there's another Yid in the hotel, you have to make an Eruv. There will be a question, as we just said, if you all eat together, or let's say, for example, you eat separately, but you sleep together, these would be questions. But most, I don't know nowadays, what the hotels usually they eat and sleep separately anyway. So, okay. So, right. So the Mishnah told us halacha, 2 halachas. 1, if there's partitions in a hallway, in a big gym, in a big hall, according to Beis Shammai, it's 5 different houses. According to Beis Hillel, it's 1 house. Beis Hillel agree to Beis Shammai if it's upstairs, downstairs, or separate rooms. The Gemara now says 4 different explanations as to what exactly the partitions are made out of. That means the Mishnah was not so clear. The Mishnah just says that you've got 5 families living in one big hall, and they have partitions between them. Now, there are many levels of partitions. For example, you can have wood, which is a very solid one, or you can have curtains, which is very loose. You can have a partition that goes 10 tefachim high, or all the way to the ceiling. Which partition the Mishnah is talking about? That means they could argue that the bigger the partition, then it's more likely that Beis Hillel would agree that it's a separate room, because if you've got a partition all the way to the ceiling, or you could say no, that there's a smaller partition, even Beis Shammai would agree that that's not considered a partition. So we have 4 different explanations in our Mishnah. So the Gemara gives 4 explanations. What is the partition which the Mishnah is talking about? Let's see the Gemara inside. Omar Nachman, Machlokas b'Mesipus. The Machlokas with a temporary partition. Ava b'Mechitza Asor. If you've got a proper fence, even if it's only 10 tefachim high, even Beis Hillel agree that that's considered a partition. So let's say we're evacuated and we're all stuck in one hall for Shabbos, and we decide to put a fence which is 10 tefachim high. Even Beis Hillel would agree that that's considered a separate home. That is one explanation in our Mishnah. Ikadami, second explanation. They argue in both cases. They argue both in the Mechitza, which is 10 tefachim, and in the Mechitza, which is temporary. They argue in both. So the first Lashon, they only argue temporary, not a Mechitza 10 tefachim. And the second Lashon is they argue in both. Sorry, I did that. Here we have another 2 explanations, but as the first 2 came from Rav Nachman, these 2 do not come from Rav Nachman. Machlokas is when their partition reaches the ceiling. If the partition doesn't reach the ceiling, everybody agrees it's one family. Machlokas is when their partition doesn't reach the ceiling. And if they reach the ceiling, everybody agrees you need a Eruv for each group. So we have 4 explanations. And the trick over here is to work out which one fits with the other. That means, do they all necessarily argue or not? I'll try to explain it briefly. Let's go through again. The Mishnah talks about 5 families set up shop in one hall. And there are partitions. We have 4 explanations what the partition is. Either it's a temporary one, or we're talking about even a higher one, meaning one which is made out of 10 tefachim, or one which is up to the ceiling, or one which is a big mechitza but not up to the ceiling. Now, Rashi points out, the Mandoma who says the mechitza has to reach the ceiling, that's the machlokas. Obviously, he argues on all the other expressions, because he obviously doesn't agree with Nachman that when there's a 10 tefachim high mechitza, there's no machlokas, because he's talking about mechitza all the way to the ceiling. And secondly, he doesn't agree with the second notion that the machlokas is either by a temporary or by mechitza 10 tefachim, because in either way, the mechitza is much higher. The second notion of Nachman, where the machlokas is by mechitza which doesn't reach the roof, even that, says Rashi, is mistaba, not like Rav Nachman's 2 Lashonos. Because when you talk about a partition which doesn't reach the ceiling, you're talking about a proper partition. And Rav Nachman was talking about a partition that doesn't even reach only 10 tefachim or temporary. Okay, we'll come to it more in a moment. We have to establish. We have a machlokas Sham and Beis Hillel when a few families come together in one hall. And we have a machlokas, when is the machlokas? And we have 4 explanations what the partition was made out of. Either temporary, or 10 tefachim high, or very high but doesn't reach the ceiling, or even more than that, it reaches the ceiling. Says the Gemara Daf Ayin Beis Amud Beis, the top of the page. Beis. We have a kasha. Omar Yehuda Hasabo. Hasabo means the one who says with logic. The word sabo is the same word as svoro, the one who could think of logic. So Rabbi Yehuda, the logical one. That would be a good way to describe it. Rabbi Yehuda said as follows: if the partition reaches the ceiling, even Beis Hillel agree that's a separate family. For example, we move into a hall for Shabbos and we set up a partition which reaches the ceiling. Even Beis Hillel, who are maker in our Mishnah, they would be machmir in such a case. Why would they be machmir in such a case? Because since the partition reaches the ceiling, so obviously we're separate homes now. It's like we're 5 different families. So when did they argue? On partitions which don't reach the ceiling. Each one has to provide his own Eruv. All together they can provide one Eruv. Again, when the partitions reach the ceiling, says Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, That's 5 different families, and therefore, if you want to be able to carry from one person to the next, you're going to have to make an Eruv. When the petitions don't reach the sinning, so Shammai say it's 5 different families, Basila say it's 1. Says the Gemara now, let's work out this brisa with the 4 explanations we had in our Mishnah. How does it work? Let's work it out. Says the Gemara like this. That they even argue when the partition reaches the ceiling, tiyufta. This brisa is a tiyufta. What's tiyufta mean? What's tiyufta?
There's
Nothing
no answer.
done.
I didn't catch. Sorry, what does tiyufta mean?
There's no answer.
No answer. Very good. A kasha with no answer. So according to the Mandoma, that they argue when the partition reaches the ceiling, this brisa is a tiyufta. It's a kasha without an answer. Because in this brisa it clearly says that they do not argue when the partition reaches the ceiling. That they only argue when it doesn't reach the ceiling, which was the 3rd explanation, siata. This brisa is a proof, because this brisa says the same thing. The machlokes is only by a temporary. But if it's got 10 tefachim high, everybody agrees it's partitions to yufta. It's also a kasha without an answer. Why? Because Rav Nachman in that Loshen said that once there's 10 tefachim high partition, then what's the din? Everybody agrees it's separate homes. If everybody agrees it's separate homes, so why does the Brisa talk about a partition which reaches all the way to the ceiling, even if it's just 10 tefachim high? It's no good. So they argue both by 10 tefachim and by temporary. Let's say that this Brisa is a tiyufta, meaning that if you hold the machlokas is also by temporary, also by 10 tefachim, and also by mechitza, which almost reaches the ceiling, why did the Brisa only talk about the case where the partition almost reaches the ceiling? It should have talked about a case where the partition was only 10 tefachim high, and even then the machlokas is. Answers the Gemara, no, it's not a tiyufta. No, they argue in all the cases. That means Rav Nachman said the argument between Misham and Beis Hillel is by a temporary partition. The Brisa is talking about a machlokas with not a temporary partition, but a proper partition, a proper fence. But the Brisa doesn't necessarily exclude the case of Rav Nachman. Perhaps the Brisa is also talking about even in the case of Rav Nachman, meaning the machlokas Misham and Beis Hillel, whether a partition is considered a division and there are different families, is both in the case when it is a temporary division and both in the case when the mechitza is 10 tefachim high. So then the obvious question would be, why talk about a mechitza? Why not talk about mesipas? Why not talk about temporary division? Answers the Gemara, I want to show you the brilliance, the strength of Beis Hillel's heta. What's the strength of Beis Hillel's heta? Because Beis Hillel said that even in the case where you have a big partition, which almost reaches the ceiling, nevertheless, I consider you, all 5 families, as being one family. Why? Because I say to myself, since the partition doesn't reach the ceiling, you are obviously one family. So by talking about such a case, had they only talked about a temporary partition, you would have said, they still are not saying such a brilliant chiddush. Why? They talk about a very flimsy partition, and that is why it's like 5 families, and that's why it's like one big happy family. But when you have a proper partition, then you wouldn't say such a thing. That's why Beis Hillel had to talk about a case where there's a proper mechitza, and after PK, Beis Hillel say that what's the din? That it's a mechitza, that it's one big family, and therefore you don't need to make an eruv. Let's tell us the machlokas when there's only a temporary division, and even so, Beis Shammai say you need to make another eruv. And that would show us the greatness of Beis Shammai's chumrah, that even with a temporary division, they say it's 5 families. And it's more koach te'etei odif, we always try to prove the svar of the maker. And as Rashi in Beitz, the famous Rashi says, that a chumrah is not such a brilliant thing. Why is a chumrah not so special? Why is a chumrah not special?
You'll do it even if you're not sure.
Very good. As Rashi says, you don't need to know anything to be machmir. Anybody can be machmir. Anybody can say something's awesome. Because at the end of the day, if you know nothing, just say it's awesome. But part of the reason we have so many chumras nowadays is because we don't know so much. Since we don't know, we always have to be machmir. But the point is, somebody who says something is mutter, only a huge Talmud Chacham can say something is mutter. So therefore, over here, we're trying to say a issa or a heter, we come to say a heter to show this koyach of Beisilo. And so what koyach the teodif? Omar Nachman, Omar Rab, halacha b'Yehuda Sabo. The halacha is like Yehuda Sabo. Then the machlokes is only by divisions which are almost to the ceiling. But if the division reaches the ceiling, even Beis Hillel agree that what? That it's 5 separate families. Omar Nachman Yitzchak Mastis Namideka. I'll be medayek this from our Mishnah. Diktoni. Umoidim is managed with Sosan Shum Mechadom Ba'aliyos. Beis Hillel agree that if people live either in separate rooms or in upstairs and downstairs, Shesrichin Eruv L'chol Chabur V'Chabur, every group needs its own Eruv. What do we mean when we say rooms and upstairs and downstairs? If we talk about truly separate rooms and truly separate upstairs and downstairs, pshita, what would the havamina be that they're shared areas? I live upstairs, you live downstairs. What's the havamina that we have a joint ownership? We don't. You have one, I have the other. If we want to carry in the garden, of course we need to do an eruv. We mean something which looks like a room and it looks like an upstairs. A fence which reaches the roof. I just want to summarize because now the Gemara is going to change the whole pshat. Let me summarize like this. If a person has many families staying by him for Shabbos, he does not need to make an eruv to his garden. Why not? It's all his family. You can have your cousins and your neighbors and your friends. One family, you do not need to make an eruv. If you live in the same house as someone else, and you own one room, he owns the other room, everybody agrees that you have to make an eruv. And it's very, very important. For example, sometimes a person owns the hotel, he owns a room, he has to be careful to carry it from his hotel room to the corridor. Or for example, a person rents a flat, and one person owns one flat, one other person owns the other flat, he has to make an eruv to be able to carry into the garden, etc. That's all clear. So if you've got a lot of guests, you do not need an eruv. If you own separate properties, even if it's within one building, you do need to make an eruv. The machlokes b'Shamar b'Hillel is what? Is when you've got one room and it's a division, which is like a flimsy, or it's not a real division. Do we consider it as separate houses? Or do we say, no, it's not separate houses, but rather it's one room? And Beis Hillel agreed to Beis Shammai that if the partition reaches the ceiling, then we'll consider to be separate rooms, and therefore it is no good. That is the halacha. That's the halacha we've got so far. Right. Now the Gemara is going to change the whole malach of the Mishnah, and the Gemara is going to say no. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel never argued about that, and Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel both agree that when you have 5 families staying in one room, it is one family, even when there's partitions, and therefore you do not need to make an eruv. You can carry from one end of the hall to the other, even if there's partitions in the hall. But Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel over here arguing about a separate issue. What are they arguing about? They're arguing as follows. When you make an Eiruvin chatzeros, what you do is you get 5 families. Let's say there are 5 families living around one chatzah. Each person has to donate 1 slice of bread, and then you have your Eiruvin chatzeros, which you put in one house. Right? Let's say you did a Eiruvin chatzeros, and then you decide that you want to join up with your neighbors. You've got one cul-de-sac, and you want to join up with another chatzah, and they too have 5 families around one chatzah. So now we have a discussion. What are you supposed to do? The machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is as follows. According to Beis Hillel, we look at it as follows: that since all 5 have become joined together with the slices of bread which they made for the Eiruvin chatzeros, it is sufficient that one family takes bread across to the other chatzah and says to the chatzah, we want to join in with you. One family is enough. Beis Shammai say, no. You want to join with the next person's chatzah, every one of the families around chatzah number A has to bring bread to chatzah B. Again, we're talking about 5 families in the house. Everybody agrees they're considered to be like one happy family. and therefore they do not need to make an Eruv between themselves. The Machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is only when you make an Eruv Chatzeros, and then afterwards you want to make and join up with another Chatzah. Does each individual family have to give a slice of bread? Or do we say, look, just like from per family, you only give one slice of bread. So now that already made in the Eruv Chatzeros, you only need to give one slice of bread from the entire Chatzah to the next Chatzah. That's what the Machlokes Shammai is saying. Shammai is saying you need to give every family their own. And we still say, no, it's enough for one family to give. Is it clear? Because this is a very important issue. Okay, we'll see it in Sinai again. Tana. When they bring the Eruv to another place, that Beis Shammai say that everybody has to donate an Eruv for the next one. Let's get again. We've got one courtyard, call it courtyard Chatzah number A and Chatzah number B. Chatzah number A has got 5 families. Chatzah B has 5 families. Chatzah A and Chatzah B are adjacent to each other. They're next to each other. Chatzah A, all 5 families made an Eruv together, and so did Chatzah B. Do we need now that every one of A should bring bread to B, or only one person? Beis Shammai say everybody, they still say only one. That is, they only argue when A try and make an Eruv with B by taking food across. Let's say B decide to bring food into Chatzah A, then what's the halacha? Everybody agrees that you do not need to go to every family. Meaning that if Chatzah A make an Eruv together, and now Chatzah B made their own Eruv, and they're now bringing their bread into A, they don't need to put the bread in every family, they could just put it in one and that's good enough. Again, let's say inside. When they take it to another Chatzah, one Eruv is good enough for all of them. It says, Five people that claim an Eruv together, when they take the Eruv to the next place, one Eruv is enough. Who does it go like? Because according to Beis Shammai, what do you have to do after you made Eruv Chatzeros? You have to take to the next one. The Machlokes Beis Shammai is when the Eruv comes to them. The Beis Shammai say that everybody has to bring an Eruv to them, to every single one of the families. And they still say it's enough to one. But when you're taking an Eruv to another Chatzah, everybody agrees that you have to have per family their own bread. It says, look, sorry, who's it go like? I told you to summarize. We've got Machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, when you've got 5 families together in one Eruv, and they made an Eruv together, and now they want to transfer the Eruv to the next Chatzah. According to Beis Hillel, one person is enough. According to Beis Shammai, all 5 families. The second notion of the Gemara, the second version of the Gemara is that everybody agrees, everybody has to provide an Eruv. But the Maisa, the Gemara says that doesn't fit in with the Brisa, because the Brisa clearly says that only one person needs to take it. The Maisa, we pass on that Eruv Echad Lekulam, meaning that if all 5 of us have already made an Eruv together, and now we want to join with another Chatzah, it's sufficient that one of us takes some bread across, and that's it. New Mishnah. The Mishnah is discussing a situation like this. You've got a Chatzah, and around it there's a few houses. Let's say one house belongs to the grandfather, and the other houses belong to his sons. Each one has their own family. What would you say? Do they need to make an Eruv, or do they not need to make an Eruv? What would you say with the logic? You've got like a family compound. One to the grandfather, the what's the word for patriarch, and then you've got every son has his own property around the Chatzah. Do they need to make an Eruv or not?
Yes, if they live in separately, then you think they need one.
Very good. I would also say that. Very good. I would also say that logic. Now, what would happen if the patriarch is supporting them all, and whenever they need breakfast, dinner, and supper, they go to his house to eat it?
So it's like you're saying like about the shared dining room. Same idea.
Oh, very good. This is what that Shuvah was discussing. Okay, I should jump the gun a bit. Okay, but what would happen, for example, if they get the food from the patriarch, and then afterwards they take the food to eat it in their own houses. These are the shilas which we're discussing now. It means like this. If everybody sleeps and eats together, that's obvious. We don't care if there's 1,000 people. It's one family, it's one home, fine. If they all sleep and eat separately, it's different families. The fact that you're my brother and you're my cousin and you're my father makes no difference. At the end of the day, I have my house, you have your house. And if I want to carry from my house into the garden belongs to both you and me. So therefore, I'm carrying from a Shusay Yochid into an area which belongs to more than one person, it belongs to a few people. The question only becomes difficult when not that I own my own property, but when I eat with you. I eat with the father. That's the question. Very good. They eat always by the father. But they sleep at home. They need to make their own eruv. From this Mishnah, if I was to ask you, how do you define your house? Where you sleep or where you eat? What would you say?
Where you sleep.
Where you eat.
Wake up your minds. It's where you sleep. And again, they all eat together and they sleep separately. The halach is they have to have an eruv. Why do they have to have an eruv? Because we consider them as separate homes. So we see that sleeping is more of an establishment of my home than eating, because regarding the eating, we'll eat together. Imagine one of the brothers doesn't join the eruv, he has to do bitter l'shus. The Mishnah over here says two colors, which are very hard to understand why. This is what Mishnah says. We've got a family where everybody eats together but sleeps separately. And as Shiur pointed out, sleeping is very important. And therefore we consider each home to be a separate home. So you can't carry from the house into the chutzah. But eating, doesn't matter where you eat together. It says the Mishnah two colors. Color number one. If there is nobody else in the chutzah, only the grandfather and the sons, and nobody else in the chutzah, you do not need an eruv at all. Why? Because then we say that this is already, since at the end of the day we eat together, so we have some sort of connection. When there's other people, let's say there's a father, 3 sons and 2 strangers. So because there's 2 strangers Yidden, you have to make an eruv. Once you have to make an eruv, you can't say the father and the 3 sons are all 4, one family, and therefore they only have to provide 1 slice of bread, because at the end of the day, they don't sleep in the same house. They all sleep in separate houses. So once they have to provide an eruv anyway, we consider each home to be a separate home. But if there's no strangers, there's only a father and 3 sons in the chutzah, then you do not need to make an eruv at all. It's a very strange svara. When there's strangers, so therefore we look at each house separately and everybody needs to give their own eruv. When there's no strangers, we say all the eruvs together. Another kula. If, for example, they made an eruv and somebody is just bringing the food to them, he does not need to include all of them. He could just bring the food to the grandfather, and that's good enough for the whole family. Because at the end of the day, we look at them as like semi-in-between as to whether they're like one happy family or separate families. So when you need to make an eruv, so then we look at them separately. When they don't need to make an eruv, either because there's no strangers, because somebody's bringing the eruv to them, then we look at them as being one entity. Says the Gemara, Shema Mino, from our Mishnah is a raya, Mokim Lino Goyim, that when we want to establish a person's house, we go after his bed. Why? Because they all eat together, they sleep separately. And you said in the Mishnah that they have to make an eruv. Why do you have to make an eruv? Because look at those separate families. It's a raya that sleeping is more important than eating. It says, we don't mean when they eat together. What we mean is that their father supports them, that he gives them food. After he gives them the food, what do they do with the food? They go home and eat it at home. So they're eating at home and they're sleeping at home. The only thing they're sharing together is that the father is one who provides all the food. So if you've got no raya that sleeping is more important than eating or vice versa, we're just discussing that they're getting the food from grandfather, but they're actually eating it in their own house. A person who owns Majan, you've got a beautiful mansion. And do you remember, like Heaton Park, we go one of the entrances, there's actually in the gate, there's a little ability, there's like a house within the gateway. It's the one which you come off Skulls Lane, the very big entrance. It's locked. But there's actually a little hut within the gateway. So imagine I own a mansion. and somebody asks me, can I live in your gatehouse? Or Achsad, he wants to live in my corridor. Or Marpeses, he wants to live on my balcony. He does not require to make an Eruv. Why? We look at it as it's my home, and he's only sharing with me because he's not really got a proper living space, and therefore I don't need to make an Eruv. But if somebody says to me, look, can I use one of your houses as a storeroom for my wood, for my straw, or for my cattle, or or for any other storehouses, as a olav, it asks. Why? Because it's a proper house. Only the usage of the house is for not such an important thing, but it's a proper house, and therefore it does make it require an Eruv. It's only also mokim tira, meaning that only if you're living, not if you're just storing your wood there. Says Rabbi Yehuda, I'll prove it to you. Rabbi Yehuda, there was a person called Ben Nafcha. He had 5 chatzeros in Usha. He owned 5 properties. Wealthy person owns 5 properties. Now, he couldn't possibly live in all 5 properties. He could only sleep in one bed. However wealthy you are, you can only sleep in one house. So what did he do with the other 4 houses? He used them for storage purposes. And what did they say? So you see that a storehouse doesn't hassle. Again, if somebody asks to live in my balcony, I do not need to make an Eruv, or he asks to live in my corridor, or to live in my gatehouse, I do not need to make an Eruv. Why? It's my house, it's just joining me. If somebody asks that I've got a chotzer, can I take one of your properties to store things? He does asa. Ravina says it doesn't asa. Furthermore, the Gemara asks now, just in between, Beis Dira Sakadatach, Beis Dira sounds like any sort of building, whether a person can live inside it or not. And the Gemara asks Akash, if it's unlivable, then of course that doesn't asa. Elo'ema Mokim Dira, it's a place where a person can actually live. My Mokim Dira, what is considered a living space? Machlekas. Rav Omar Tov Gimel Omad Aleph, Mokim Pisa, a place where he eats, Shmuel Omar Mokim Lina, a place where you sleep. So let's just summarize, we're going to stop over here. A person asks you that I want to take a property in your chotzer. Imagine you've got a courtyard, 5 families, and there's one empty property. And he says, I want to take one of those properties. If he lives there, he now has to join your Eruv, or your Eruv is no good. If he stores things there, it's a machlekas, Tanakama, and Rabbi Yehuda. If he lives there for partly and partly not, we have a machlekas, Rav and Shmuel. According to Rav, we look at where he eats. If he eats in my chotzer, then what would happen is, that is my home. And if that is the home, therefore, I have to ask him to join my Eruv. Shmuel says we have to go where he sleeps. This actually has a very, very big ramification, which goes on and on and on in the poskim to do with Chanukah. Does anybody know what this has to do with Chanukah?
Where you light your candles.
Oh, there was a very big issue when Ponevezh was first set up. Ponevezh Rav was the Rosh Hashiva of Ponevezh, wanted the Bochum to light in the dining room. And when they came to the Chazanish, he told them to light in the bedroom. And there's a big machlekas which has been unresolved personally. Many persons could say, does the bedroom be the main place where you light? Where are you defined? Let's say, for example, you eat in one place, you sleep somewhere else. Where is defined to be your home? And that is an unresolved machlekas, and therefore many persons can say that what should the bacha do, which many bachim do anyway, is that they eat in the bedroom as well, because many bachim like to take food, to get parcels, etc. So eat in your bedroom, and then that way your bedroom becomes also your eating place and also your sleeping place. There are some yeshivas that they consider it a fire hazard, and they say whether we pass them one way or another, we do not care. You have to light in the dining room because we don't want to have candles in every bedroom in the building. Imagine what could happen. But halachically speaking, it is a big question. This is the machlekas. So this is where we're going to continue from tomorrow, a machlekas, and this is what the Gemara is going to discuss. Is a person's home defined by where he eats, or is it defined by the place where he sleeps? What's more important, eating or sleeping? Depends. When you're hungry, you think eating is probably more important. When you're tired. Very good. Shkoyach Hamdi for joining in.
Thank you.
Tomorrow morning we'll do the next one. It'll be uploaded. I cannot do tomorrow night. It's mid on the Chasna. And Thursday, Mitzvah Shem, it's back in its place. One tiny thing is that I think on Thursday it's
A little
10
bit earlier.
because there's a shiur regarding tag, which I've got and everything. But nice.
Shkoyach, Mazel tov.
Oh, dear, thank you. Thank you.